a serial killer drama, Werewolf the podcast. Welcome to the show. Go down to the description and follow links, share us, follow us on Spotify if you would, that'd be great, or on Apple, that really helps our numbers. And guess what? We love you. I've been kicking at this curb with my worn out shoes. I've been running into strangers that say I know you. I don't wanna be a proud man, just wanna be a man. A little less like my father, more like
He was a fine fool, was fate. I find him funny. Wow, that was a lot of alliteration. But with a voice like this, why not? This voice is made for poetic vices and vibes. Thank you for hearing me like this. You have done me a fine favour. I have left his world, fate's fortress. Oh, it's a hateful place, all austere and brooding castliness. Gargoyles and gloom hang off the stone walls. It gives me the heebie-jeebies. He had made the mistake of playing me at a game of chance. Again. He had lost once, but as with most power-corrupted narcissists, he thought that he had learnt his lesson, and that something as impossible as that would never happen again. Being sensible humans, you can wonder how the fate can play a game of chance. According to his own rules, there is no chance. And in playing me, he had no chance. No chance against me. I was the chancer. I had walked away from the remonstrating non-god. He'd thrown a huge tantrum at losing, all sweary and blazing green eyes flashing about. I have to admit it. I enjoyed his little hissy fit. Far too serious a non-god to have a hissy fit. I materialise in the office, as I call it. My movement is a little based on Descartes' ideas. I'm glad he had them. It made my existence a little easier. Not I think, so therefore I am, but I think, and that is where I am. The 10th level of hell is my office. It tends to coalesce and form itself around my mood. Maybe I don't travel to it. Perhaps I create it, and it comes to me. There's an interesting thought that has no relevance to this story, really. Today, it was a very modern living room, all grey walls and pine. On the wall was love, laugh, live in big words. We couldn't have that. Loss, lust, and lechery flashed into being where the nonsense once had been. My secretary is sitting and waiting for me very inattentively. I scratch her behind the ears. I know she enjoys it, and she purrs in response. Oh, don't get that weird, for Giselle Trudeau is a demon. But at the moment, she sits on an armchair by the fire as a small black cat, a little black shadow with evil yellow eyes. She's so cute, but even I won't tell her. I walk to my somewhat out-of-place Baroque desk. It's covered in piles of papers, books, and general detritus. I'm bored with that stuff now, and can't be bothered with it. So it flashes into flame and is gone. "Working hard there, I see," says the sarcastic little demon. "That's one way to deal with the paperwork," she continues. I turn to her briefly and laugh. She does make me smile. I sit and wiggle into the leather office chair that accompanies the now clear desk, putting my feet up on it to get comfortable while I think. "Anything interesting happening?" I ask the cat. "You know better than me. Can't you see I'm busy here?" returned the demon. Again, her sarcasm amuses me, and although I could destroy her with a thought, I love the little cat's sass. Yes, sass is an excellent word to describe it. I drop the 7 dice from my hand to the tabletop and smile as the dice all roll up a 1. The demon stops her grooming to observe the dice quickly before returning to her personal care. "Can I get an Earl Grey, please?" I ask my secretary, who is busy licking parts of her that others would find impossible to reach on themselves. I wonder if that's why she likes her current form. The cat stops as though affronted by the question, giving me a somewhat venomous look with those yellow-slitted irises. She's so cute. "Of course you can. You don't need my permission. And while you're up, can I get a saucer of milk?" she says with a luxuriant and sibilant tone. "You are exceptional at your job," I tell the little cat. "Why, thank you," she replies, ignoring the sarcasm.
The Professor. The drive from Ernest to Aberdeen was utterly refreshing. I have to say that this little car is a dream to drive. However, I may have to add cruise control for the motorways, perhaps. Maybe not, though. I suppose a foot pressed solidly to the floor's enough of a cruise control for most of the time. This little engine managed to cruise between 120 and 140 without blowing up. Quite impressive. I had stopped briefly a few times for petrol as the little car was drinking it rather thirstily, but I took a much longer comfort break at Annandale Services. Annandale Services are built on a temple to an old god. She's a sylph called Brer and lives happily now in the duck pond out the back of the building. It was nice to catch up with her, and we shared sacrificial croissants, her particular favourite. I hadn't seen her for a number of years, and it's always nice to see these now rare beings doing well in the modern world. If you get a chance to stop there, feed her. Your day will become a lucky one. She's a nice little duck like that. After our chat, I hit the road again. Aberdeen, here I come. I reached the glorious granite city at about 9:30 p.m. in the evening. After finding a parking spot in the general melee of traffic, I made my way to ICU. At the nurse's desk, I was asked to wait for the on-call doctor, Graham Wilson. As he walked to the desk, I shook the man's hand. "Simon de Montfort," I introduced myself. I admire these chaps. They're utter magicians of a sort, magicians with their own kind of magic. I have a somewhat jarring and difficult job, but these individuals, as I, are always walking the edges of life and death. They're true heroes, as are all of our NHS workers. That actually, the NHS, was one of my best suggestions, and good old Nye Bevan got it through Attlee's government rather nicely. The doctor was exhausted and stressed, and I had the feeling that was how he'd spent most of his life, to be honest. "How's Ben doing?" I asked him. He's not good, actually." His voice was heavy with woe. I could see that this man cared deeply. "Well, I need you to be honest," I told him. He nodded and dropped his eyes from mine. During my many years on this earth, this body language had never been followed by good news. He has major injuries leading to many issues. His legs have been crushed, and they're broken in more places than we can identify. This has led to traumatic rhabdomyolysis, crush syndrome, which may lead to renal failure in turn. With that, with multiple internal bleeds. His abdomen has been badly crushed. His pelvis is destroyed, and the damage to the internal organs, it's significant. His eyes held pure weariness in his words. His skull is fractured. The pressure is building at several points inside there. The prognosis is poor. We've been trying to stabilise him since he arrived. If we can do that, then we can think of next steps, you know. But at the moment, there just is no next step. We're just fighting fires of a sort. The man's face was full of sorrow. It's a sort of miracle that he's made it to this point, to be honest. I have to say, it's doubtful that he makes it through the night. He finally lifted his eyes to mine. Those eyes were full of resignation and sorrow. "I'm so sorry," he told me, and I could genuinely see that he was. I sighed and nodded, briefly looking up and shaking my head in disbelief at this usual callousness. "No apologies, if you please. I can see you're doing all you can. May I see the patient?" He ferried me down a corridor. Ben was in his own room. At the door was one of the Norwegians, Anya, in a seat. He nodded at me. I smiled, and he allowed me to pass. A true professional soldier. He didn't even stop me to speak. He knew I needed to be in there. Ben was supported, semi-sat up in a bed. Something like a huge box covered his lower body. His head was swaddled in padding and what would have been bandages in the past. Plastic, scaffolding of sorts surrounded the man. They must literally be trying to hold him together. Wires and pipes lay everywhere. He was hooked into a number of monitors and a ventilator. I had to stop momentarily as a son of the 12th century. You, as modern people, have no idea how things have changed. What the modern medical world can do is nothing short of miraculous. In the corner was a sleeping Sula. I'd like to say that she looked like a sleeping beauty, but that would have been somewhat of a lie. She'd managed to make herself comfy by conglomerating a nest with a cosy chair, a coffee table, several NHS blue blankets, and a couple of borrowed pillows. Her gentle snores were disguised by all the other sounds the room held. The sucking and blowing of the ventilator, and the machine that goes ping. I turned to wake her, but the doctor touched my shoulder gently and shook his head. "She needs a rest as much as he does," he whispered as he smiled and nodded. "She wouldn't leave his side, you know," he told me. I nodded. Of course she wouldn't. I pulled up a seat next to Ben's bedside. Now, we wait.
Will, these are the moments that I truly love. The moment before the kill, when all is still and all is well. How quickly things change. There will be running and screaming. There will be crying and dying. I will be worrying and ripping young flesh today. Families will feel the loss I feel. The emotions that rack my mind will be for others to share. I sat in the shelter of the trees, a small distance from the playground. My senses flourish as I appraise my targets. I am a giant shadow in the dark of the surrounding shade. I am ready to go. And then she stood in front of me. When I refer to she, I refer to the devil, to Lucy Fur. One moment I was on my own looking at the rich buffet of human delectables, my mouth drooling at the thought of the next few moments of death and killing. But as I had moved, she had been there, a finger on the tip of my wolfy nose. She stood before me, shaking her head, and her beautiful dark locks, a simple touch, stopped all my forward momentum dead. Her point of contact shocked me into relaxation. It flowed down my body. It's difficult to focus on something at distance when someone is touching the end of your nose. The kids were forgotten. She stood arm outstretched and still shaking her head with what seemed a little disapproval.
These souls are not to be taken today. It is fated,
she said. Then suddenly we both disappeared. On the grassy mound where we had both stood was a single white die. A white die, of course, showing a fucking 6.
The Professor. I sit by the bed of a man on the edge. He is in between the worlds at this moment. Where that is, unlike many of you, is paramount in my mind. I've been there quite a few times, to be utterly honest. Unlike the ubiquitous versions of the in-between we get told of, it's just a place of pure darkness and no sense. No, not nonsense. No sense. Although its existence could be thought of as being absurd. You float in a void. It's not even darkness. It's just the absence of light. There cannot be darkness if there's never a chance or opportunity for there to be light. It's not one of God's realms. This place cannot exist. But that's where you go. Unlike Keith in Chelmsford after his heart attack, you don't see a light that you want to move towards. Unlike Monica O'Ding in Madrid, the angels do not come to meet you. Unlike Neris in New Orleans, you don't float above the room looking down on yourself. These things are made by the imagination of the mind to hide the horrible reality that the waiting room for the next step is pure nothing. In fact, it's less even than that. It doesn't exist. And yet, it does. I'm not sure if this is quantum and shit or magic and bollocks, but it just is. You may wonder how I know. Well, I've died a total of 38 times that I can remember in my lifetime, and no existence, and sitting in this blackness. It's always a thought-provoking time and place. I hold Ben's hand. It has an oxygen sensor on it and a cannula taped into the back. I do something that I normally wouldn't consider. I press my forehead to his hand and I pray for him. You see, I know he's up there. God. I know he is. Would it do him any harm for once to help me instead of hindering me? For him to do something miraculous that actually mattered? That's what the bastard's famous for, isn't it? For God's sake. I then speak to the young man himself. He trusted me. He trusted that I would do all I could to protect him, and I had not. Forgive me, Ben, I said out loud. Must have been just loud enough, or so out of sync with the sounds of the room that I disturbed Sula's sound slumber. The young woman woke and wiped her sleep-bleary eyes. They were open but swollen with the tears that had filled them recently. I smiled, not knowing how she was going to respond to my presence. Have every right to be angry with me, and I readied myself to bear her emotional blows.
How long was I asleep?
She asked. It was more of a rhetorical question than anything, to be honest, but my answer was cut short by the sound of alarms. Ben died. His hand grip went tight and then relaxed. His pulse's reassuring on-off tone had gone, and it had been replaced by a single monotone on the monitor. His heart had stopped. The room went into slow motion as a well-choreographed panic ensued. The first movement was the explosion of Sula from her nest as she tried to get to Ben. Soft furnishings flew. She wasn't thinking, and at that moment would have just gotten in the way of everything, so I grabbed her bodily and held her back as she half-heartedly struggled before turning towards me with eyes of fear. And I held her as she buried her head in my chest. A nurse ran to check the systems. She pushed her way past me as she looked at monitors, respirators, and injection pumps. I watched as I rocked the sobbing woman in my arms. As the first woman worked, another nurse burst into the room and was told in no uncertain manner, "Crash team!" as lights flew on and the room went into madness. I moved us to the back of the room, holding Sula's shoulders as she turned, wiping her eyes to watch as the medical staff did their amazing jobs. It was like watching a dance of sorts, as each of the people present knew precisely their role and their task. Seconds dragged into minutes as they attempted to restart. Ben's heart. I held her. It was all I could do. All the people were gone. All the machines were off. There was just Sula. And me. And, well, Ben. Sula was broken. She'd gone past the point of crying. She had no more tears. She just shuddered as I held her. As I held her tight, I stood looking over her shoulder at Ben. This boy. This boy who had died because of me. He was another on my long, long list. No, not those that have died because of me. That was beyond my comprehension. Neither was he on the equally long list of friends I'd lost over the years. No. Worse than that. He was on the long list of those who had believed in me and who had relied on me to keep them safe, and whom I had failed. More to add to my guilt-ridden mind and my crushed conscience. As I held Sula, a lone nurse walked in. She was dark-haired and very beautiful. Her green uniform had been tailored to fit, bespoke. She brought a finger to her bright red lips, signalling for me not to talk. I watched her. Was it her? Yes, of course it was. I made as if to speak, but she shook her head and smiled as she rummaged in the pockets of her trousers, taking out a white die. She proudly showed it to me, while she pouted. I was confused, of course, but I still held Sula, comforting her as I watched things unfold. If she did anything to that boy, well, what? What would I do? This was the devil. Well, she was well out of my jurisdiction. She patted Ben's arm and smiled as she bent, and whispered something in his ear. As she straightened, she laughed at something. I don't know what, but she found something amusing. She left his side for a moment and carefully placed the die on top of the monitors whilst on tiptoes to check if the 6 was the uppermost number. It was comforting to watch the care she took. She returned to his side again, where she laughed at some unknown thing that amused her as she stroked Ben's cheek, before placing a kiss upon it. Turning to me, she winked, and took a deeply dramatic bow. It was all so incongruous. On rising, she flicked the switches on for the monitors. Huh? There was the sound of the long tone. No heartbeat. The respirator didn't move. Holding my eye contact, she clicked the fingers of her right hand. Just clicked her fingers. And suddenly, the machines all sprung into life. Showing life. The satisfying ping of a heartbeat and the deep whisper of the respirator started once more. She smiled.
Ta-da!
She said, as she pointed to stage right and disappeared.